The howl of wind carried her name through the streets like a curse, and by the time Esther Kimball reached the edge of town, ice had already begun to form on her eyelashes. She stumbled forward through the mounting snowdrift, her thin cotton dress offering no protection against the February storm that had descended upon Hays City, Kansas, with biblical fury. Behind her, the voices of the townspeople grew fainter, their condemnation swallowed by the wind, but their words still echoed in her mind. Witch, demon, unnatural. All because her eyes held different colors, one green as spring grass and one blue as summer sky, a condition her mother had once called a gift from God before the fever took her. Now the same townsfolk who had tolerated her presence while her father lived had finally found their excuse to cast her out, and the preacher's wife had led the charge with righteous fury burning in her pale face. The storm had come at the worst possible time, or perhaps the best time if mercy meant a quick death rather than slow starvation on the prairie. Her feet had gone numb inside her worn boots, and Esther could no longer feel the ground beneath her. The world had become nothing but white and cold, and the desperate struggle to take one more breath, one more step. She had no destination, no hope of shelter, only the animal instinct to keep moving because stopping meant death. The wind shrieked around her like all the demons they had accused her of consorting with, and she wrapped her arms around herself in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. Blood from her split lip had frozen on her chin where the blacksmith's son had struck her, calling her a freak, before his mother pulled him away. That had been the beginning of the end, the moment the simmering distrust had boiled over into action. She fell for the first time when her boot caught on something buried beneath the snow. Her hands plunged into the icy powder, and the cold bit through her skin like knives. Esther forced herself up, knowing that lying down would be the end, but her legs shook with exhaustion and cold. How long had she been walking? Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning in the white void. Her father's watch, the only thing of value she owned, pressed against her chest beneath her dress, but she could not bring herself to abandon it even though its weight seemed to grow heavier with each step. The second time she fell, she could not rise so quickly. Her vision had begun to blur, and warmth was creeping through her limbs in a way that some distant part of her mind recognized as dangerous. They said freezing to death was peaceful at the end, like falling asleep. Perhaps that would be better than the life that awaited her, even if she somehow survived. A woman alone on the frontier with no money, no family, and a face that marked her as different would find few opportunities beyond the kind that destroyed the soul. She was trying to push herself up when she heard the sound of hoofbeats, muffled by snow but unmistakable. Esther lifted her head, squinting through the swirling white, and saw a dark shape materializing from the storm. A horse and rider, moving with purpose despite the conditions. For a moment, hope flared in her chest, but then reality crushed it. Whoever this was, they would see her eyes and turn away, or worse, drag her back to town to face whatever punishment the preacher's wife had devised. The rider pulled up beside her, and a man's voice cut through the wind. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" Esther tried to answer, but her jaw had locked with cold. She could only stare up at him, this stranger whose face was obscured by a heavy scarf and hat. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, and his horse was a massive bay that stamped impatiently in the snow. The man did not wait for an answer. He swung down from his horse with practiced ease and crouched beside her, his gloved hands reaching for her arms. "Can you stand? We need to get you out of this storm or you will die." Up close, she could see his eyes above the scarf, dark brown and filled with urgency rather than judgment. He pulled her to her feet, and Esther's legs nearly buckled, but he caught her with surprising gentleness. For a moment they stood face to face, and she saw his eyes widen as he registered her mismatched gaze. Here it comes, she thought, the revulsion, the fear, the anger. Instead, he said, "Hold on to me," and lifted her onto his horse before swinging up behind her. His arm came around her waist, solid and warm even through the layers of clothing, and he spurred the horse forward into the storm. Esther's mind was too foggy to process what was happening. She slumped against the stranger's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his thick coat. The horse moved with confidence despite the blinding snow, and she realized the rider must know exactly where he was going. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer, and then suddenly there were dark shapes around them, buildings forming a windbreak against the storm. The rider guided his horse to a barn and dismounted, then reached up to lift Esther down. Her legs would not support her weight, and she collapsed against him. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms and carried her through the snow to a small house set back from the barn. He kicked the door open and brought her inside, kicking it shut again behind them. The absence of wind was shocking. Esther could hear the storm battering the walls, but inside was warm and dim, heated by a stove that glowed in the corner. The stranger carried her to a chair near the stove and set her down gently, then unwrapped the scarf from his face. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features weathered by sun and wind. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, and several days' worth of dark stubble shadowed his jaw. "We need to get you warm," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. He began pulling off his gloves, then reached for her boots. "Your feet, can you feel them?" Esther shook her head, still unable to speak. Her whole body was shaking now, violent tremors that she could not control. The man worked quickly, removing her boots and examining her feet with efficient movements. He rubbed them gently, checking for frostbite, then wrapped them in a blanket he pulled from a chest against the wall. "Your hands," he said, reaching for them. Esther pulled back instinctively, but he caught her wrists with surprising gentleness. "I am not going to hurt you. Let me see." She let him take her hands, watching his face for signs of disgust or fear, but he focused on examining her fingers, rubbing warmth back into them. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living, but his touch was careful. "You are lucky," he said after a moment. "No frostbite that I can see, but that was close, too close." He looked up at her then, meeting her mismatched gaze directly. "What were you doing out in that storm? Where did you come from?" Esther's jaw had unlocked enough for her to speak, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Hayes City." His eyebrows rose. "That is 5 miles from here. You walked 5 miles in this storm," she nodded, and tears suddenly burned in her eyes, though she tried to blink them back. She would not cry in front of this stranger, would not show more weakness than she already had, but he must have seen something in her face because his expression softened. "You are safe here," he said. "Whatever happened, you are safe now. My name is Daniel Keller. This is my ranch, such as it is. You are welcome to stay until the storm passes, and you are well enough to tell me what happened." "They threw me out," Esther said, the words coming in a rush now. "The town. They said I was cursed, that my eyes were the devil's mark. The preacher's wife said I brought bad luck, and when the miller's baby died, she convinced everyone it was my fault. They threw me out into the storm and told me not to come back." Daniel's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "They threw a woman out into a blizzard. Those righteous Christians threw you out to die." "I am different," Esther said, gesturing to her eyes. "I have always been different. My father protected me while he lived, but he died 3 months ago, and after that, there was nothing to stop them." Daniel stood and walked to the stove, adding wood from a stack beside it. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but angry. Different is not the same as cursed. Different is not the same as evil. Those fools would not know the devil if he preached from their own pulpit. He turned back to her. Your eyes are unusual, yes, but I have seen such things before. My mother had a sister with eyes like yours. She was the kindest woman I ever knew and the smartest. She taught me to read when I was a boy. Esther stared at him, unable to process this. You do not think I am cursed. I think you were born different, and small-minded people fear what they do not understand. He pulled another chair close to the stove and sat down, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. I think you nearly died tonight because of their ignorance and cruelty. And I think you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why would you help me? You do not know me. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. 5 years ago, I was working a ranch in Wyoming. There was a man there, Mexican fellow named Rodrigo, best horse trainer I ever saw. He had a gift with animals, could gentle the wildest Mustang without breaking its spirit. But some of the other ranch hands did not like having a Mexican working alongside them. They beat him one night and left him in the snow. By the time I found him, it was too late. He died in my arms, and I have carried that weight ever since. He met her eyes again. I told myself if I ever had the chance to do differently, to be better, I would take it. So here we are. The simple honesty of his words broke something inside Esther, and the tears she had been holding back spilled over. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that came from someplace deep and raw. Daniel did not try to comfort her with empty words or unwanted touch. He simply sat quietly, giving her space to grieve everything she had lost. When the tears finally subsided, Esther lowered her hands and found Daniel holding out a handkerchief. She took it gratefully, wiping her face. I am sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. He stood and moved to a cupboard, pulling out supplies. You need food and rest. When did you last eat? Esther tried to remember. Yesterday morning, I think, before they came for me. Daniel made a sound of disgust and set about preparing a meal. Esther watched him move around the small kitchen area with efficient movements, clearly a man accustomed to taking care of himself. The house was simple but well maintained. One large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with what looked like a bedroom door on the far wall. The furnishings were plain but sturdy, and everything had its place. He heated soup on the stove and cut thick slices from a loaf of bread, then brought the food to her. Eat slowly. Your stomach will not take kindly to too much at once. The soup was simple, beef and vegetables, but it was the most delicious thing Esther had ever tasted. She forced herself to eat slowly as Daniel had advised, though hunger clawed at her belly. He sat across from her with his own bowl, eating in silence while the storm continued to rage outside. How long have you lived here? Esther asked between bites. 2 years. I saved my wages working other men's ranches until I could buy this land. It is not much yet, just a small herd of cattle and a few horses, but it is mine. No one to answer to but myself. It must be lonely. Daniel shrugged. I prefer my own company to most people's. Animals are more honest than men, and they do not care about the color of your skin or where you came from or whether you believe the right things. He paused. Though I will admit, the winters can be long. Esther finished her soup and set the bowl aside, feeling warmth spreading through her body for the first time in hours. The shaking had finally stopped, and exhaustion was settling over her like a heavy blanket. Daniel noticed her drooping eyelids and stood. You need rest. You can take the bed. I will sleep out here. I cannot take your bed, Esther protested. You have already done so much. You can and you will. You nearly froze to death tonight. You need proper rest in a proper bed." His tone left no room for argument. "Come on." He led her to the bedroom, which was as simply furnished as the main room. A large bed dominated the space, covered with thick quilts. Daniel pulled back the covers and gestured for her to climb in. Esther did so gratefully, still fully dressed, and he tucked the quilts around her with surprising gentleness. "Sleep as long as you need," he said. "The storm will likely last through tomorrow, so there is no rush." "Thank you," Esther said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Thank you for saving my life." Daniel looked down at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Different is what I need," he said softly. "This world has too many people who are all the same, all thinking the same thoughts and fearing the same things. Different is rare. Different is valuable." He stepped back toward the door. "Sleep now." He closed the door behind him, and Esther lay in the darkness, processing his words. "Different is what I need." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. She had spent her entire life being told that her difference was a curse, something to hide or apologize for. But Daniel had looked at her mismatched eyes and seen something valuable. She fell asleep with those words echoing in her mind, and for the first time in months, she slept without nightmares. Esther woke to pale light filtering through the window and the sound of wind still battering the house. For a moment she was disoriented, unable to remember where she was, but then memory returned in a rush. The storm. The stranger. Daniel Keller, who had saved her life and told her she was valuable. She sat up slowly, testing her body. Everything ached and her feet were tender, but the bone-deep cold was gone. The quilts had kept her warm through the night, and she could smell coffee brewing somewhere beyond the bedroom door. Esther climbed out of bed and opened the door to find Daniel standing at the stove, cooking breakfast. He turned at the sound and nodded to her. "How do you feel?" "Sore but alive, thanks to you. Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." She took a seat at the small table and watched him work. In the daylight she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a rough way, with strong features and capable hands. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at his collar, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. He set a plate in front of her, eggs and bacon and fried potatoes, and poured her a cup of coffee. "The storm is still going," he said, sitting down across from her. "Looks like it might blow itself out by tonight, but the snow is deep. You will need to stay at least another day or two until the weather clears and the roads are passable." Esther wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, savoring its warmth. "I do not want to impose on you." "You are not imposing," I offered. He took a bite of eggs, chewed thoughtfully. "What will you do after the storm passes? Do you have family anywhere, friends who might take you in?" The question made her chest tighten. "No. My father was an only child, and my mother's family disowned her when she married him. They said he was not good enough for her, coming from nothing like he did. As for friends, well, you saw how the town treated me." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then you will need to make a new start somewhere else. Do you have any money?" Esther touched her chest where her father's watch rested beneath her dress. "Just my father's watch. It is gold, might be worth something, and I can work. I am strong and I can cook and clean and handle animals. My father raised me on our small farm before he got sick." "Keep the watch," Daniel said firmly. "It is your inheritance, your connection to your father. You should not have to sell it." He was quiet for a moment, then looked at her directly. "I have a proposition for you if you are willing to hear it." Esther's heart began to beat faster. "What kind of proposition?" "I need help on the ranch. Winter is the slow season, but come spring, I will have calving and branding and 100 other tasks that are difficult for one man alone. I can offer you room and board in exchange for work. You can stay in the house. I will move my things to the barn, fix up a room there for myself. Everything proper and respectable. You would have your privacy and I would have help with the ranch. It was more than Esther had dared to hope for. A place to stay, work to do, and a chance to start over. But doubt gnawed at her. You would do that. Let a stranger stay on your property. You are not a stranger anymore, and I am a good judge of character. I think you are exactly what you seem to be, a woman who got dealt a bad hand and is doing her best to survive. He leaned forward slightly. I will be honest with you, Esther. I could use the help, yes, but more than that, I do not like the idea of you out there alone with nowhere to go. The frontier is hard on women, especially women without protection. If you stay here, you will be safe. I give you my word. Esther studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. Daniel Keller was exactly what he appeared to be, a decent man offering help to someone in need. It seemed almost too good to be true, and part of her waited for the other boot to drop, for him to name some price that would make her decision impossible. But he simply waited, patient and calm, for her answer. Yes, she said finally. Yes, I would like to stay and work for you. Thank you. Relief flickered across Daniel's face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Good. That is settled then. When the storm clears, I will move my things to the barn and set up properly. Until then, we will manage as we are. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, and afterward, Daniel taught her the layout of the house and where everything was kept. The day passed slowly, with the storm continuing to hammer at the walls and windows. They talked in fits and starts, sharing pieces of their pasts in the way of two people still learning to trust each other. Esther learned that Daniel had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who lost everything in a bad year and died of heartbreak soon after. His mother had followed within a year, leaving Daniel alone at 17. He had worked his way west, taking whatever jobs he could find, learning everything about ranching and horses and surviving on the frontier. He was 26 now, and this ranch represented 9 years of hard work and careful saving. Daniel learned that Esther's father had been a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity, which was why they had ended up in Hays City. He had bought a small farm with the last of his money, but his health had been failing even then. Esther had nursed him through the final months, watching him waste away from the cancer that ate at his insides. She was 22, and the farm had been sold to pay his debts, leaving her with nothing but the watch and the clothes on her back. The town's hostility had been building for years, but while her father lived, no one had dared act on it. His death had removed the last barrier between her and their fear. As evening fell and the storm finally began to weaken, Daniel built up the fire and pulled out a worn book. "Do you read?" he asked. "Yes. My mother taught me before she died. I was 10. Would you like me to read aloud?" "It helps pass the time." Esther nodded, and Daniel began to read from a collection of poetry. His voice was deep and steady, and she found herself relaxing as she listened. They sat like that for hours, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, while outside the storm slowly died away. That night, Esther lay in Daniel's bed again and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been walking to her death, cast out and condemned. Now she had a place to stay and work to do, and perhaps, if she was very lucky, the chance to build something like a real life. She thought about Daniel's words again. Different is what I need. They had planted themselves in her heart like seeds, and she could feel them beginning to grow into something that might be hope. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached halfway up the windows and the landscape sparkled under brilliant sunshine. Daniel was up before dawn, already dressed in heavy layers, preparing to dig out paths to the barn and check on the animals. "Stay inside and keep warm," he told Esther. "This will take me a few hours, and there is no point in both of us freezing." But Esther was not content to sit idle while he worked. She found a heavy coat hanging by the door, clearly Daniel's spare, and wrapped herself in it. It was far too large, but it was warm. She pulled on her boots, which Daniel had set by the fire to dry, and followed him outside. Daniel turned at the sound of the door and frowned. "I told you to stay inside." "And I do not take orders well," Esther replied. "You have 2 hands, I have 2 more. The work will go faster with both of us." For a moment she thought he would argue, but then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. "Fair enough. There is another shovel in the barn if we can get to it." They worked together to dig a path through the deep snow, taking turns breaking through the drifts. The work was hard and cold, but Esther threw herself into it with determination. She would not be a burden, would not be the helpless woman who needed constant care. She would earn her place here through sweat and effort. The barn was warmer than she expected, heated by the body warmth of the animals inside. Daniel had 3 horses, including the big bay that had carried them through the storm, and a small herd of cattle in a connected shelter. He moved among them with easy familiarity, checking their water and feed, running his hands over them to check for any problems. "This is Cooper," he said, stroking the bay's neck. "He is the one who found you. Fool horse kept trying to turn into the storm instead of heading home. I thought he had lost his mind until I saw you in the snow." Esther approached slowly and held out her hand for the horse to sniff. Cooper blew warm breath over her palm, then nuzzled her shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered to the animal. "You saved my life too." Daniel showed her around the barn, explaining his system for feeding and care. "Come spring, I am hoping to buy more cattle and maybe another horse or 2. Build this place into something substantial, but that is a long way off. For now, we focus on keeping everyone alive through the winter." They spent the rest of the morning doing chores, and Esther quickly fell into the rhythm of the work. Her father's small farm had taught her the basics of animal care, and Daniel was patient in showing her the rest. By midday, they were both exhausted and frozen, and they retreated to the house for hot food and coffee. "You did good work today," Daniel said as they ate. "Better than some men I have hired in the past." Esther felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise. "I told you I could work." "I meant it. I can see that." He paused, then added, "I am going to move my things to the barn tomorrow. Get that room set up properly. It will be better that way, more appropriate." Esther wanted to protest, to tell him he should not have to give up his own house, but she understood the necessity. A man and woman living under the same roof without being married would cause talk, and while Daniel might not care what others thought, she did not want to bring trouble to his door after everything he had done for her. The next few days fell into a pattern. They worked together during the day, caring for the animals and maintaining the property. The snow was so deep that venturing beyond the ranch was impossible, so they were isolated in their own small world. In the evenings, they would cook together, and afterward they talked or read or played cards with a worn deck Daniel produced from a drawer. Esther found herself watching Daniel when he was not looking, studying the way he moved, the way his face would soften when he talked about his horses, the way his hands were always busy, always working. He was unlike any man she had known before, completely comfortable with silence but also willing to share his thoughts when the mood struck him. He never commented on her eyes except to meet her gaze directly, never flinching or looking away. For his part, Daniel seemed to enjoy her company. He laughed more easily as the days passed, and sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. There was something building between them, some connection that went beyond employer and employee or even friendship. It frightened Esther even as it thrilled her, because she had never felt anything like this before, and she did not know what to do with it. A week after the storm, Daniel announced that he needed to ride to Hayes City for supplies. Esther's stomach dropped at the mention of the town. "I will come with you," she said immediately. Daniel shook his head. "That is not a good idea. If those people see you, there could be trouble. Then I will stay hidden. But I cannot stay here alone, Daniel. I need to face them eventually to show them they did not break me." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you stay with me the whole time, and if anyone starts trouble, we leave immediately." "Agreed, agreed." They set out the next morning, both mounted on horses. Daniel had given Esther one of the other horses, a gentle mare named Rosie, and she handled the animal with confidence born of childhood experience. The ride to Hayes City took several hours through the snow-packed trails, and Esther's anxiety grew with each mile. The town looked exactly as she remembered, a collection of rough buildings clustered along a single main street. People stopped and stared as they rode in, and Esther heard the whispers start immediately. Daniel kept Cooper close to Rosie, his presence a solid wall of protection. They stopped at the general store, and Daniel helped Esther dismount. "Head high," he murmured. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Inside, the store was warm and crowded with people seeking refuge from the cold. Conversation stopped when they entered, and Esther felt dozens of eyes on her. The storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson, looked between them with obvious surprise. "Keller," he said with a nod. "Did not expect to see you in this weather. And Miss Kimball, I heard you had left town." "I was cast out to die in the storm," Esther said clearly, her voice carrying through the sudden silence. "But I survived, no thanks to anyone here." Henderson had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Now, Miss Kimball, I am sure it was not like that." "It was exactly like that," Daniel cut in, his voice hard. "And before anyone here decides to continue that particular brand of Christian charity, I should mention that Miss Kimball is working for me now. She is under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with her has a problem with me." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Daniel might keep to himself, but he had a reputation as a man who could handle himself, and no one in the store seemed eager to challenge him. Henderson cleared his throat and busied himself with gathering the supplies Daniel requested. They were loading the supplies onto the horses when the preacher's wife appeared. Martha Green was a thin, sharp-faced woman with eyes like flint. She looked at Esther with undisguised hatred. "You should have stayed gone," she said. "Your kind brings nothing but trouble and sin." Daniel stepped between them so fast that Martha actually stumbled backward. "Her kind," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You mean a woman who never hurt anyone? A woman whose only crime was being born different? What kind of Christian are you, Mrs. Green, that you would condemn someone for something they cannot control?" "The Bible says to cast out the wicked," Martha spat. "It says the devil takes many forms. The Bible also says to love your neighbor and care for the stranger among you. Seems to me you pick and choose which parts to follow." Daniel took a step forward, and Martha retreated. "Miss Kimball is a good woman who deserves better than she got from this town. If I hear that anyone from Hayes City has bothered her or threatened her in any way, I will come back and we will have a different kind of conversation. Do I make myself clear?" Martha's face had gone white, but she lifted her chin. "You will regret protecting her. The devil's spawn brings misfortune to all who shelter them. The only misfortune I see is small-minded people spreading poison," Daniel said. He turned back to Esther and helped her mount Rosie. They rode out of town without looking back, but Esther could feel the weight of hostile stares following them. They had gone about a mile when Esther finally spoke. "You did not have to do that. You did not have to make an enemy of the whole town for me." "I did not make enemies. I simply told the truth." Daniel glanced at her. "Besides, I do not need friends who judge people by the color of their eyes instead of the content of their character. You could lose business. They might not sell to you anymore. Then I will ride to the next town. There is always another town." He pulled Cooper to a stop and waited for her to do the same with Rosie. "Esther, I want you to understand something. I do not make promises lightly, and I do not do things halfway. When I said you were under my protection, I meant it. That is not going to change because some ignorant townsfolk get their feathers ruffled." Esther felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were not tears of despair. "I do not know how to thank you. You have given me so much, and I have nothing to give in return." Daniel's expression softened. "You give me company. You give me help with the ranch. You give me someone to talk to who does not treat me like an outcast for preferring solitude." He paused, then added quietly, "And you give me someone worth protecting. That is more than enough." The ride back to the ranch was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Esther kept replaying the confrontation with Martha Green, the way Daniel had stepped between them without hesitation, the fierce protectiveness in his voice. She had never had anyone defend her like that before. Even her father, much as he loved her, had always counseled her to keep her head down to avoid drawing attention. But Daniel did not ask her to hide. He told her to hold her head high. "Different is what I need," he had said, and now she was beginning to understand what he meant. He saw her difference not as a flaw to be tolerated, but as something valuable, something worth defending. That night, after the chores were done and dinner was finished, they sat by the fire in the main room. Daniel had a saddle that needed mending, and he worked on it while Esther darned a pair of his socks. It was a comfortable, domestic scene, and Esther found herself imagining what it might be like if this were truly her home, if Daniel were truly hers. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, and Esther realized she had been staring into the fire. "Nothing important. Try again." His voice was gentle but insistent. "You looked 1,000 miles away." Esther set down her mending. "I was thinking how strange life is. A month ago I was alone and afraid, waiting for the town to turn on me. Now I am here with you and I feel safer than I have in years. It does not seem quite real." Daniel put aside the saddle and gave her his full attention. "It is real. You are here and you are safe, and that is not going to change. But for how long? Winter will end, and then what? I cannot stay here forever, Daniel. People will talk. Your reputation will suffer. Let them talk. My reputation is my concern, not yours." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Esther, I am going to be honest with you about something. When I found you in that storm, I told myself I was just helping someone in trouble. But these past weeks, having you here, working with you, talking with you, I have realized something." He paused, and she saw uncertainty flicker across his face for the first time since she had met him. "I do not want you to leave, not when winter ends, not ever. I want you to stay." Esther's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Daniel, I do not understand." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I care about you. More than I should, probably, considering how little time we have known each other. But I cannot help how I feel." He met her mismatched gaze steadily. "I am saying that if you wanted to stay, permanently, as more than just someone who works for me, I would be the happiest man in Kansas." The world seemed to tilt beneath Esther. "You want me to stay as what? Your wife?" "Eventually, yes. If that is what you wanted too. I know it is fast, and I know you might not feel the same way. I am not asking you to decide right now. I'm just telling you how I feel so you know where I stand." Esther stood up, needing to move to process what he was saying. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, her mind racing. Daniel Keller wanted to marry her. This good, honest man who had saved her life wanted her to stay, to be his wife. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to grab onto this chance for happiness with both hands. But another part of her was terrified. "I am different," she said without turning around. "You say that now like it is a good thing, but what about later? What if you get tired of people staring, of people whispering? What if you start to see me the way they do?" She heard Daniel stand and cross the room to her. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I will never see you that way. Your eyes are beautiful, Esther. They are unique, and they are part of what makes you who you are. I would no more want you to change them than I would want the sky to be a different color." Esther turned to face him, and the sincerity in his expression took her breath away. "I care about you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was gratitude or relief or anything but what it actually is. But the truth is, when I think about leaving here, about leaving you, it feels like losing everything all over again." Daniel reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his rough, warm hands. "Then stay. Stay with me. We will build a life here together, you and I. We will make this ranch into something real, something that lasts, and anyone who does not like it can go to hell." Esther laughed, a shaky sound halfway to a sob, and then Daniel was kissing her. His lips were gentle at first, questioning, but when she kissed him back, he pulled her closer. Esther wrapped her arms around his neck and let herself fall into the sensation, the warmth and strength of him, the feeling of being wanted and valued and safe. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," Esther confirmed. "Yes to staying, yes to building a life with you, yes to all of it." Daniel's smile was brighter than the sun on snow. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a question. "We will do this right," he said. "I will court you properly, and when the time is right, we will get married. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours." "I do not need courting," Esther said. "I already know what I want. Maybe you do not need it, but you deserve it. You deserve to be wooed and cherished and treated like you are precious. So that is what I am going to do." Over the following weeks, Daniel kept his word. He courted Esther with a sweetness and dedication that made her heart ache. He brought her wildflowers that he somehow found blooming in sheltered spots, despite the snow. He taught her to ride better, taking her on long trips around the ranch property and showing her the land that would be theirs together. He read to her every evening, and they talked for hours about their hopes and dreams for the future. They worked side by side during the day, and Esther discovered that she loved ranching. She loved the horses and cattle, loved the feeling of physical exhaustion after a hard day's work, loved the satisfaction of seeing the animals thrive under their care. Daniel praised her efforts generously, and Esther bloomed under his approval like a flower under the sun. They were careful to maintain propriety, with Daniel still sleeping in the barn, but the emotional intimacy between them grew deeper every day. Esther learned that Daniel had a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh until her sides hurt. She learned that he was fiercely protective of things he cared about but gentle with anything vulnerable. She learned that he sang while he worked, old songs his mother had taught him, and that his voice was surprisingly good. Daniel learned that Esther was braver than she gave herself credit for, that she had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue when provoked. He learned that she loved books and had memorized whole passages of poetry. He learned that she had a gift with animals, particularly horses, and that Cooper followed her around like a devoted dog. Winter began to loosen its grip on the land, and the first signs of spring appeared. The snow melted in patches, revealing the brown grass beneath. Ice broke up in the streams, and the days grew longer and warmer. Daniel began making plans for the spring work, expanding the herd and making improvements to the ranch. One evening in early March, he asked Esther to take a walk with him. They bundled up against the lingering cold and walked out past the barn to a spot where the land rose slightly, offering a view of the entire property. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. "This is my favorite spot on the ranch," Daniel said. "I come here when I need to think." "It is beautiful," Esther agreed, taking in the view. She could see the house and barn, the fences that marked the property boundaries, the creek that ran through the eastern edge. It was not a large ranch compared to some, but it was well managed and clearly built with care. "I wanted to bring you here because I need to ask you something." Daniel took both her hands in his. "I know I said I would give you time, that I would court you properly, but I cannot wait any longer. Esther Kimball, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the person I build a life with?" Esther felt joy bubble up inside her, bright and effervescent. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." Daniel whooped and picked her up, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. He set her down and kissed her with a passion that made her toes curl, and Esther kissed him back with equal fervor. This man, this wonderful man, wanted to spend his life with her. It seemed too good to be true, but it was real as the solid ground beneath her feet and the setting sun above. "I do not have a ring yet," Daniel said when they finally broke apart, "but I will get you one, the best one I can afford." "I do not need a ring, I just need you." "You are getting a ring anyway, and a proper wedding. I want to do this right." They married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in the next town over, a place called Ellis, where no one knew them or cared about Esther's eyes. The ceremony was simple, conducted by a justice of the peace with 2 witnesses pulled in from the street, but it was perfect. Esther wore a new dress that Daniel had bought her, simple blue cotton that matched one of her eyes, and Daniel wore his best shirt and a nervous smile. When the justice pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed her with such tenderness that Esther felt tears slip down her cheeks. They were married. She was Esther Keller now, and she had a home and a husband and a future that looked nothing like the bleak prospects she had faced just a few months earlier. They spent their wedding night at a small hotel in Ellis, and Daniel made love to her with patience and care, taking his time to show her all the ways a man could worship a woman. Esther had been nervous, knowing little about what to expect, but Daniel guided her gently, making sure she was comfortable and cared for. By the time dawn broke through the window, Esther felt transformed, claimed and cherished in equal measure. They returned to the ranch the next day, and Daniel carried her over the threshold of the house with exaggerated ceremony that made them both laugh. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keller." "I have been here for months," Esther pointed out. "Yes, but now it is official. This is your home, not just a place you are staying. Everything here is ours together." That night, Daniel moved his things back into the house, into the bedroom they would now share. Esther helped him unpack, and they reorganized the space to make it truly theirs. It felt right, natural, as if they had been living together as husband and wife for years rather than days. Spring arrived in full, and the ranch came alive with activity. True to his word, Daniel bought more cattle and another horse, a young stallion he planned to train. The days were long and exhausting, filled with endless work, but Esther had never been happier. She worked alongside Daniel from dawn until dusk, learning everything he could teach her about ranching and horses and building something that would last. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving together with the practiced coordination of two people who knew each other well. Daniel would often stop in the middle of a task to steal a kiss, and Esther would laugh and push him away, telling him to get back to work even as she kissed him back. In the evenings, they would collapse into bed, exhausted but content, and Daniel would hold her close while they talked about their plans for the future. "I want to build a bigger house eventually," Daniel said one night, tracing idle patterns on Esther's shoulder. "Something with a real parlor and a proper kitchen, maybe even a second floor." "That sounds wonderful," Esther agreed. "Though I am quite fond of this house, it is where we became us. We can keep it as a guest house or for hired hands when we get successful enough to need them." He paused, then added carefully, "And we will need more space if we have children." Esther's breath caught. They had not talked about children yet, though she had thought about it often. "Do you want children?" "I want everything with you. A family, a legacy, something we build together that outlasts us both." He rolled over to look at her in the dim light. "Do you want children?" "Yes," Esther said softly. "I want to fill this house with love and laughter. I want to raise children who know they are valued for who they are, not what they look like or how they fit someone else's expectations." Daniel kissed her forehead. "They will be beautiful, just like their mother, and if any of them have your eyes, I will count us doubly blessed." Esther felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You really mean that?" "Every word. I fell in love with your eyes first, did you know that? When I pulled up beside you in the storm and you looked at me, I thought I had never seen anything so striking in my life. And then I got to know the woman behind those eyes, and I fell even harder." They made love then, slow and tender, and afterward, Esther lay in Daniel's arms and thought about how far she had come. Less than a year ago, she had been alone and condemned, facing death in a blizzard. Now she was married to a man who loved her, working to build a life that was truly hers. It seemed impossible, miraculous, but it was real. As summer arrived, the ranch prospered. The cattle thrived on the rich prairie grass, and Daniel's herd grew. He had developed a reputation as a fair man and a skilled rancher, and other homesteaders in the area began to seek his advice. Esther, too, became known, not for her eyes but for her skill with horses and her sharp mind for business. There were still those who looked at her with suspicion, still whispers that followed her when they rode into Ellis for supplies. But Daniel's presence beside her was armor against their judgment, and gradually, people began to accept her. Some even went out of their way to be friendly, drawn by her quiet competence and Daniel's obvious devotion. Esther discovered that she had a talent for healing animals, a gentle touch and intuitive understanding that Daniel swore was magic. She helped birth a difficult calf one night, staying up until dawn with her hands inside the laboring cow, and when she finally pulled the calf free, alive and bawling, the owner nearly wept with gratitude. Word spread, and soon people were bringing her their sick animals, asking for her help. "You are building a reputation," Daniel said with pride. "Pretty soon you will be too busy to help me with the ranch work." "Never," Esther said firmly. "This ranch is ours together. Everything else is secondary." But she did take on the occasional animal patient, and it brought in extra money that they saved carefully. They were building something solid, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. It was slow work, but it was satisfying, and every small victory felt monumental. In August, Esther missed her monthly courses. She waited a week before saying anything to Daniel, afraid to hope, but when the second week passed with no sign, she could no longer deny the possibility. "Daniel," she said one evening after dinner, her heart hammering, "I think I might be with child." Daniel went very still, his eyes searching her face. Are you sure? Not completely, but all the signs are there. I am late, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings, and my breasts are tender. She wrapped her arms around herself. I know we talked about wanting children, but I am still frightened. What if something goes wrong? What if I cannot do this? Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. You can do anything. You are the strongest person I know. And nothing is going to go wrong because I am going to take care of you every step of the way. You promise. I promise. We are going to have a baby, Esther, our baby. Can you believe it? Joy was spreading through Esther's chest, warm and bright. We are going to be parents. The best parents, Daniel agreed. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently. I love you so much. Thank you for giving me this gift. As the weeks passed and Esther's pregnancy became undeniable, Daniel became even more protective. He insisted she reduce her workload, though Esther argued that she was perfectly capable of doing everything she had done before. They compromised, with Esther handling the lighter tasks and Daniel taking on the heavier work. Esther's body changed, her belly swelling with their child, and Daniel was fascinated by every development. He would place his hands on her stomach and wait to feel the baby kick, his face lighting up with wonder every time. At night, he would talk to her belly, telling their unborn child stories and making promises about the life they would have together. You are going to be so loved, he would whisper. Your mother and I are going to make sure you know every day how precious you are. Winter returned, and with it came the memory of the storm that had brought them together. On the anniversary of the day Daniel had found her, they stood together at the window and watched snow fall gently from the sky. You ever think about how close we came to never meeting? Esther asked, her hand on her swollen belly. All the time. If I had left 5 minutes later, if Cooper had not insisted on turning into the storm, if you had fallen just a little farther from my property, everything would be different. Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, cradling her and their unborn child. But we did meet. You were cast into the snow for being different, and I found you because different is what I needed. We were meant to be, Esther. I truly believe that. Esther leaned back against him, feeling safe and loved and grateful beyond words. So do I. Their son was born on a cold February night, almost exactly a year after the storm that had brought Esther to Daniel's ranch. The labor was long and difficult, and Daniel paced the floor while the midwife from Ellis worked with Esther. He could hear her cries of pain through the bedroom door, and it took every ounce of his self-control not to burst in there and demand to know what was happening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard a different sound. The thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. Daniel's legs nearly gave out with relief, and when the midwife opened the door and beckoned him in, he practically ran into the room. Esther lay propped up in bed, exhausted and sweaty but radiantly happy, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at Daniel with tears streaming down her face and held out their son. Daniel took the baby with trembling hands, hardly able to breathe. The infant was tiny and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that had not yet settled on their final color. He was perfect. We made this, Esther whispered. You and I, we made a person. The most beautiful person in the world, Daniel agreed. He sat on the edge of the bed, unable to look away from his son. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their baby, Esther said, What about Matthew? It means gift of God, and he is certainly that. Matthew Keller, I like it. Matthew, welcome to the world, son. We have been waiting for you. Matthew proved to be a healthy baby with powerful lungs and his father's appetite. Esther recovered from the birth more quickly than the midwife expected, and within a few weeks, she was back to helping with lighter ranch work, though Daniel fussed over her constantly. They adjusted to life with an infant, taking turns walking the floor with Matthew when he fussed, learning his different cries and what each one meant. Daniel proved to be a devoted father, completely unashamed to be seen carrying his son or changing his soiled diapers. Esther would often find him in the rocking chair, holding Matthew and singing the old songs his mother had taught him, and her heart would swell with love for both of them. As Matthew grew, he revealed himself to be a happy, curious child with his mother's stubbornness and his father's calm temperament. And when his eyes finally settled on their permanent color, Esther held her breath, waiting to see if he would have her unusual trait. But Matthew's eyes were a warm brown, like Daniel's, and while part of Esther was relieved that her son would not face the prejudice she had endured, another part of her was oddly disappointed. She had wanted to see her difference reflected in her child, to know that she was not alone in the world. Daniel seemed to sense her mixed feelings. "We might have other children," he said gently. "And even if none of them have your eyes, Matthew will grow up knowing that different is beautiful because his mother is beautiful. We will teach him to see the world the way it should be seen, with acceptance and love." True to his word, Daniel raised Matthew to value diversity and question prejudice. As the boy grew, he would ask questions about why people looked different or believed different things, and Daniel and Esther answered honestly, teaching him that variety was the spice of life, and that judging people by their appearance was the mark of a fool. The ranch continued to prosper. By Matthew's third birthday, Daniel had built a new, larger house, just as he had promised. The old house became a bunkhouse for the two hired hands they now employed, young men from Ellis who were grateful for steady work and treated Esther with respect. Esther was pregnant again, and this time, the pregnancy was easier. She barely suffered from morning sickness, and she carried the baby with energy to spare, working alongside Daniel almost until the day she went into labor. Their second child was a girl, born on a warm summer evening with the windows open and the smell of prairie grass blowing through the house. She had her father's dark hair and, to Esther's secret joy, one green eye and one blue, a perfect mirror of her mother. "She is just like you," Daniel said with wonder, gazing down at his daughter. "She is perfect." They named her Clara after Daniel's mother, and she grew into a spirited child who kept them constantly on their toes. Where Matthew was calm and thoughtful, Clara was impulsive and adventurous, always climbing things she should not climb and exploring places she should not explore. And when she was old enough to understand, Esther sat her down and told her about the world and how some people might react to her eyes. "But there is nothing wrong with you," Esther said firmly, holding her daughter's small hands. "Your eyes are beautiful and special, and if anyone tells you different, you send them to me or your father. You understand?" Clara nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Papa says I have magic eyes that can see things other people cannot." Esther smiled. "Your papa is a smart man. You listen to him." As the years passed, the Keller Ranch became known throughout the area as a place of fairness and hard work. Daniel took on more help as the operation grew, and he developed a reputation for giving chances to people others would not hire. Drifters down on their luck, men with checkered pasts trying to make a fresh start, even a Chinese laborer who had been run out of another town. All Daniel asked was honest work and respect for everyone on the ranch, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. Esther ran the household and continued her work with animals, becoming known as the best horse healer in 3 counties. People would ride for days to bring her a sick animal, and she never turned anyone away, regardless of whether they could pay. She taught Clara everything she knew, and the girl proved to have inherited her mother's gift. Matthew grew into a serious young man with his father's steady nature and his mother's compassion. He had no interest in ranching, preferring books and learning, and when he turned 16, Daniel and Esther scraped together the money to send him east to school. It broke Esther's heart to see him go, but she was also fiercely proud of his ambitions. Clara, meanwhile, took to ranching like she was born to it. She could ride better than most men, could rope a steer with casual ease, and had no fear of hard work or difficult animals. Daniel doted on her shamelessly, and Esther would often find them working together in the barn, Daniel teaching Clara everything he knew while she absorbed it all with fierce concentration. When Clara was 12, a family moved into the area with a son about her age. The boy, Jacob, had been born with a twisted leg that left him with a pronounced limp. He was bright and funny, but other children teased him mercilessly about his disability. Clara became his fierce defender, bloodying more than one nose in his defense, and a friendship bloomed between them that Esther recognized from her own past. "That is going to be something someday," Daniel said, watching Clara and Jacob work together to mend a fence. "She is too young to be thinking about boys," Esther protested, though she knew he was right. "Maybe. But when she is old enough, I think we both know who she is going to choose. And I approve. That boy has heart and he does not care about Clara's eyes. He just sees her." "The way you saw me," Esther said softly. "Exactly the way I saw you. Our daughter has good taste." More years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythm of ranch life. Matthew finished school and became a teacher, returning to Kansas to work in Ellis. He wrote letters home filled with stories about his students and his growing involvement in education reform. Esther could not have been prouder. Clara and Jacob did indeed fall in love, exactly as predicted, and when she turned 18, he asked Daniel for permission to marry her. Daniel gave his blessing gladly, and they were married in a ceremony much larger than Daniel and Esther's had been, surrounded by the community they had built over the years. Watching her daughter marry a good man who loved her despite, or perhaps because of her differences, Esther felt the circle complete. She had been cast into the snow for being different, condemned and rejected by people who feared what they did not understand. But Daniel had found her, had told her that different was what he needed, and together they had built a life beyond anything she could have imagined. They had raised children who understood that diversity was strength, who judged people by their character rather than their appearance. They had created a community where people who did not fit elsewhere could find acceptance and opportunity. And they had loved each other through every challenge and triumph, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Daniel took Esther back to the spot where he had proposed, the slight rise that offered a view of the entire ranch. It was early spring, almost exactly 21 years since the storm that had brought them together, and the land was coming alive with new growth. "Do you remember when I asked you to marry me here?" Daniel asked, his arm around Esther's waist. "Of course I remember. You were so nervous you were shaking. I was terrified you would say no, that you would realize you could do better than a rough rancher with more dreams than sense." Esther leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out over the land they had built together. The ranch was substantial now, hundreds of acres with a large herd and multiple buildings. But more than that, it was a legacy, something they had created that would outlast them both. "I could never have done better than you," she said. "You saved my life, Daniel, but more than that, you gave me a life worth saving. You taught me that being different was not a curse but a gift. You gave me children and a home and a community. You gave me everything." Daniel turned her to face him, his eyes as warm and loving as they had been the day they married. "You gave me everything too. Before you, I was just surviving, going through the motions. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to build something that mattered. I found you in the snow, but you saved me just as surely as I saved you." He kissed her then, sweet and familiar, a kiss that still made her heart race after 20 years. Around them, the prairie stretched away in all directions, wild and beautiful and free. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Clara's laughter as she worked with the horses, and she knew Matthew was in town, teaching children to read and think and question. She had been cast into the snow for being different, but she had survived. More than survived, she had thrived, building a life of love and purpose with a man who saw her mismatched eyes and called them beautiful. Different was what he needed, he had said, and in finding each other, they had both found everything they needed. As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Esther Keller stood in her husband's arms and felt complete. The girl who had stumbled through the snow, rejected and condemned, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who had built something lasting, who had loved and been loved in return. And that, she thought as Daniel kissed her again, was the greatest triumph of all. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Daniel and Esther aged together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper, richer, tempered by time and experience into something unbreakable. They became grandparents when Clara gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, both healthy and loud. The boy had his father's dark eyes, but the girl had one green and one blue, just like her grandmother. When Esther held her for the first time, she wept with joy, seeing her legacy reflected in those tiny, perfect features. "What will you name them?" Daniel asked Clara, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "The boy is Jacob, after his father, and the girl is Esther, after her grandmother," Clara said, smiling at her parents. "We wanted them to carry on the names of the people who taught us what love really means." Matthew married a few years later, a school teacher named Sarah who shared his passion for education. They had 3 children, all of whom inherited their father's love of learning and their grandmother's compassionate heart. The Keller family grew and flourished, spreading out across Kansas and beyond. But they always remained connected to the ranch, to the place where it all began. Daniel began to slow down in his 60s, the years of hard work taking their toll on his body. His joints ached in the morning, and he could no longer do the heavy lifting he once managed with ease. But he remained the heart of the ranch, teaching the younger generation everything he knew, passing on his values of hard work and acceptance. Esther, too, felt the weight of years, but she continued her work with animals until the day her hands simply could not hold the tools anymore. Even then, she would sit with the sick horses, talking to them and comforting them with her presence, and the animals always seemed to respond. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a celebration at the ranch. People came from all over the county, men and women, whose lives had been touched by Daniel and Esther's kindness and generosity. There were former ranch hands who had moved on to successful careers, families who Esther had helped through difficult times, children who had been healed by her gift with animals. Standing in front of all these people, Daniel took Esther's hand and spoke from the heart. 40 years ago, I found a woman dying in the snow. She had been cast out for being different, condemned by people who were too small-minded to see her value. I took her in because I could not do otherwise, because leaving her there would have broken something inside me. But what I did not know then was that in saving her, I was saving myself. Esther gave me a purpose and a family and a life worth living. She taught me that different is not just acceptable, it is essential. Without difference, without the courage to be who we truly are, we are nothing but shadows. My wife is the bravest person I have ever known, and I am grateful every day that I found her in that storm. There was not a dry eye in the room when he finished, and Esther had to wipe away tears before she could respond. Daniel told you how he found me, but what he did not tell you is what happened after. He could have taken me to the next town, could have given me a meal and sent me on my way. Instead, he offered me a home and a job and, eventually, his heart. He defended me against a whole town that wanted me gone. He never once asked me to hide or change or be anything other than what I was. He saw my difference and called it beautiful. That is the man I married, and that is the man I have loved for 40 years. Everything good in my life, everything I have built, comes from that moment when he pulled me onto his horse and carried me to safety. I was dying in the snow, and he said those words that changed everything. Different is what I need. And he meant it. The celebration lasted late into the night, with music and dancing and stories shared by firelight. Esther watched her children and grandchildren, saw the life she and Daniel had created spreading out like ripples in a pond, touching more lives than she could count. The girl who had been cast into the snow was gone, replaced by a matriarch of a family built on love and acceptance. As the years advanced into their 70s, Daniel's health began to fail. The man who had been so strong, so capable, became frail and tired easily. Esther cared for him with the same gentle devotion he had shown her in those early days, and Daniel bore his declining health with grace and humor. "I am falling apart," he joked one morning as Esther helped him dress. "Piece by piece, I am breaking down. You are not falling apart. You are just well-loved, and well-loved things show wear," Esther replied, buttoning his shirt. "Besides, you are still the most handsome man in Kansas. You are biased. I am honest. There is a difference." They spent their days quietly, sitting together on the porch of the big house they had built, watching the ranch continue without them. Clara and Jacob ran the operation now, with help from young Esther and several of Matthew's children who had decided ranching suited them better than teaching. The legacy continued, and Daniel took comfort in knowing that everything he and Esther had built would outlast them. One spring evening, as the sun set in a glorious display of color, Daniel took Esther's hand and said, "Do you remember the first time I kissed you?" "Of course. You had just asked me to stay, told me you cared about me. I thought my heart would burst out of my chest. I was terrified. I had never felt that way about anyone before, and I was sure I would somehow ruin it. But you kissed me back, and I knew everything would be all right." Esther squeezed his hand gently. "Everything has been more than all right. Everything has been perfect. Not perfect. We have had our share of troubles and sorrows, but perfect for us." Daniel turned to look at her, his eyes still bright despite his aged face. "I am the luckiest man who ever lived, Esther Keller. You were cast into the snow and I found you, and you have made every day since worth living." "I love you," Esther said, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. "I have loved you since that first night when you told me different was what you needed. I love you too. Always have, always will, even beyond this life into whatever comes next." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of grass and earth and home. Daniel passed quietly in his sleep a few weeks later, simply failing to wake one morning. Esther lay beside him for a long time before calling for Clara, knowing that the moment she announced his death, her life would change irrevocably. 43 years of marriage, 43 years of partnership and love, and now she would have to learn to live without him. The funeral was huge, drawing people from all over Kansas and beyond. Daniel had touched so many lives, had given so many people chances they would not have gotten elsewhere. Esther stood at the grave, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and spoke about the man who had saved her life. Daniel Keller was the best man I ever knew. He was fair and honest and brave, but more than that, he was kind. He saw people for who they were, not what they looked like or where they came from. He built this ranch on the principle that different was not just acceptable but valuable, and that principle has guided everything we have done. He saved my life when I was dying in the snow, but he kept saving it every day for 43 years, just by being exactly who he was. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I am grateful beyond words that I got to be his wife. The months after Daniel's death were difficult. Esther moved through each day automatically, doing what needed to be done but feeling hollow inside. She would reach for Daniel in the night and find only empty space. She would think of something to tell him and turn to find him gone, but gradually the sharp edges of grief began to dull. Esther found comfort in her family, in watching her grandchildren grow and thrive. Young Esther, now a teenager, had inherited her grandmother's gift with animals and her grandfather's steady temperament. She would sit with Esther for hours, listening to stories about Daniel and the early days of the ranch. "Tell me again about the storm," young Esther would say. "About how grandfather found you." And Esther would tell the story again, never tiring of it because it was the story of how her life began. She told about the cold and the fear, about the moment when Daniel appeared out of the white void, about how he had looked at her mismatched eyes and saw beauty instead of curse. "He said different was what he needed," Esther would finish, "and he meant it. Your grandfather taught me that being different was not something to hide or apologize for. It was something to celebrate." Young Esther would touch her own mismatched eyes and smile. "I am glad I am different like you, grandmother." "So am I, sweetheart, so am I." Esther lived for 5 more years after Daniel's death, years filled with the joy of watching her family continue to grow. She saw young Esther begin courting a nice young man from Ellis, saw Matthew's youngest daughter publish a book of poetry, saw Clara and Jacob celebrate their 30th anniversary. The ranch continued to prosper, built on the foundation Daniel and Esther had laid all those years ago. On a cold February morning, exactly 50 years after the storm that had brought her to Daniel's ranch, Esther woke feeling strange. She was not ill precisely, but she felt as though she was being pulled towards something, called by a voice she could not quite hear. She rose and dressed with care, then walked through the house, touching things that held memories. The table where they had eaten thousands of meals together, the chair where Daniel had sat to read to her, the bedroom where they had loved each other and raised their children. Clara found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, a peaceful smile on her face. "Mama, you should not be out here. It is too cold." "I wanted to see the sunrise one more time," Esther said. "Your father proposed to me on a morning like this, did you know? The light was exactly this color, gold and pink, and so beautiful it hurt to look at." Clara sat beside her mother and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Tell me about it." So Esther told the story one last time about Daniel's nervousness and her joy, about the future they had imagined and then built together. As she spoke, the sun rose higher, warming the cold morning, and the ranch came alive with the sounds of a new day beginning. "He was right, you know," Esther said as she finished the story. "Different is what we need, all of us. We need people who see the world from new angles, who ask different questions, who refuse to be what others expect them to be. Your father understood that. He built his whole life around that principle. You both did, Mama, you and Papa together, Esther smiled and patted Clara's hand. "We did our best, and you have carried it on beautifully. The ranch, the family, the values we tried to instill, you have protected all of it. We learned from the best." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher. Esther felt tired, more tired than she had ever felt before, but it was a peaceful exhaustion. She had lived a full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had turned tragedy into triumph, had built something lasting from the ashes of rejection. She thought about that girl stumbling through the snow, certain she was going to die, and wished she could tell her that everything would be all right, better than all right. That she would find love and purpose, and a family that stretched across generations. That her difference would become her strength, that she would help build a community where all were welcome. As Esther's eyes drifted closed, she could have sworn she heard Daniel's voice on the wind, calling her name. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years, and let herself follow that beloved voice into whatever came next. Clara stayed with her mother as her breathing slowed and then stopped, as Esther Keller peacefully passed from this world into the next. She held her mother's hand and whispered thank you for everything, for the example and the love and the courage to be different in a world that demanded conformity. Esther was buried beside Daniel on the small hill overlooking the ranch, the spot where he had proposed all those years ago. The entire family gathered, 3 generations of Kellers who owed their existence to a moment of kindness in a snowstorm. They told stories and shared memories, and young Esther read a poem she had written about her grandparents, about how love could transform even the darkest moments into something beautiful. The ranch continued, as it always had, passing into the care of the next generation. The values Daniel and Esther had instilled remained its foundation. Hard work, acceptance, the belief that different was not just acceptable but necessary. Their story became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder of where they came from and what they stood for. Years later, when young Esther was old herself, with grandchildren of her own, she would take them to the graves on the hill and tell them the story of how it all began. About a woman cast into the snow for being different, about a cowboy who said different was what he needed, about a love that transformed 2 lonely people into a family that shaped a community. And the children would look at their great-grandmother's mismatched eyes, one green and one blue, and understand that they came from people who refused to be broken by cruelty, who built something beautiful from ashes, who proved that love could overcome any obstacle. The wind would blow across the prairie, carrying with it the whispers of all those who had come before, and the ranch would stand as testimony to a simple truth: that in a world that demands conformity, the courage to be different is the most valuable gift of all. And that sometimes, in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, salvation can arrive on horseback, carrying not just rescue but the promise of everything you ever dreamed possible. That was the legacy of Esther and Daniel Keller, cast in stone and memory, and the continuing life of the ranch they built together. A legacy of love, acceptance, and the unshakable belief that different was not just what they needed, but what the world needed. And in that belief, in that simple act of seeing value where others saw curse, they had changed not just their own lives but the lives of everyone who came after. The sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, just as it had on that evening when Daniel proposed, just as it had on 1,000 other evenings before and after. The ranch lay quiet in the gathering dusk, solid and enduring, a monument to everything that was best in the human spirit. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, 2 souls walked hand in hand across an endless prairie, finally reunited, their love unbroken by death or time. They had been different, both of them, in their own ways. But together, they had been exactly what each other needed, and that had made all the difference.